Well, good day, everyone, and welcome to an unusual FS Club event, one that I think is very timely. Today, we're going to be talking about 2020 vision in the 21st century, and we're going to be looking back to the year 2000 and forward to the year 2040, really based on a Gresham College event 2 decades ago. The event was a series of 5 lectures being held over at Barnard's Inn Hall, and it was written up in a report which is available on the website, quite a lengthy report, which had been summarized by the Worshipful Company of Information Technologists. And I'm delighted to have today many of the authors of that original report here today, and each one of them is going to come and comment on what they've learned over the last 2 decades and what that might portend for the subsequent 2. As ever, I must thank our sponsors, without whom these sorts of events would not be possible, and it's extremely kind of them to allow us to range so widely and freely over so many subjects, and I do appreciate their forbearance and tolerance. I note that many of them are extremely interested in the future, not least as the place where we'd all like to live, so I'm hoping that they find this as useful as I know many of you do. We've had quite a large registration for today's event, and we're nearly at the 100 mark of people listening. So it is quite interesting indeed. Now, just to get things going and to get the audience participating a little bit, I'm going to put forward a little poll for you, if I can. And I'm going to ask you, if you wouldn't mind, to answer on the poll what you see as the purpose of future scenario work. Is it best summarized as A, to predict the future, B, to plan for the future, or C, to feel better about the future? And I will give you just another 15 seconds to make your choice. We will come back at the end of the session to whether or not you've changed materially in the way you feel about this. And at the moment, in fact, I'm now about to close this. 88% of people see the purpose as to plan for the future. So an interesting point. We'll come back later and see if things have changed. Now, I wanted to get just a couple of prejudices of my own out of the way, if you don't mind. One is, a year before the Gresham College event was held in 2000, in 1999, William Sheridan published The Fortune Sellers, the big business of buying and selling predictions. He had a great book where he used naive forecasts to puncture the pomposity of economists, demographers, technology forecasters, weather forecasters, and many other professional members of what he termed the second oldest profession. Sheridan, for example, developed ruler casting to predict hurricane landfalls. He took a straight line over the locations of a hurricane over the past 24 hours and drew a line to the coast. For 28 hurricanes, his forecast error of 121 miles was only 18% higher than the U.S. National Hurricanes error of 103 miles. So it is an interesting bit here, is how much do we actually learn by pondering the future? But of course we do ponder the future, and it's a thing that we all love doing, and I can't see that it has done us any harm, which is why the question there is, do we do a lot of this stuff just to feel better? Another thing that I like to point out from time to time is how often so many of these scenarios, whatever you term them, boil down into effectively 4 similar quadrants. The individualist, who is represented by this little ball in a cup, really nothing will really go that wrong in the future. The fatalist, a bit like Eeyore, everything will happen to me. The uber egalitarian, a bit like Piglet, who is sitting there sort of saying, oh my gosh, anything can happen, something must be done, the sky is falling. And the hierarchist, the sort of the bureaucrat, if you might call it, sort of the owl, who is kind of contrasted with it. Well, things are okay within bounds, and I would contrast that with the pooh of the individualist. Now, let's see today if our speakers have come through in many different ways. We're going to touch on each one of them for 3 minutes in turn, and they will be coming on and off of the camera, because we have a limit of 6 cameras active at any one time, and so they will be flipping in and out. And then towards the end, we will have approximately half an hour for questions, and I would encourage you to use the question facility on the GoToWebinar and I will field questions to our very, very distinguished panel. So first up, if I might, is Roger Camrus, who's going to be looking back. Roger, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Michael. And if I could have the next slide, please. So, looking back to 2000, when we gave our original speeches, we were all full of hope. It was genuinely the birth of the digital age. I personally was at EY, heading up e-commerce. There were queues down the street of startups. There were big corporates all over the world saying, what does this mean for us? Will it change our whole way of doing business? It was a fantastic time, epic time. However, the NASDAQ crashed 2001, 9/11, then the recession 2008. All of those things, basically, one could say, actually rechristened 2000 as the stillborn birth of the digital age. Not a lot happened. However, 2020, we now, firstly, before the pandemic, we do see real signs that the digital age is with us. We see the fact that the digital giants who grew from booksellers and TV streaming companies are now occupying at least 25% of the value of the S&P. These are big, highly successful companies who have thoroughly exploited what I would call the era of hyper-connectivity. 2 billion people connected. Smartphone, remember that the iPhone just emerged in 2008, still very embryonic. And of course, now with digital distributed working and the COVID-19 crisis, I think we can all say, yes, the digital revolution actually is now really born. It's still in its infancy. But it's all about hyperconnectivity. So where do we go in 2040? Given that I think we are going to see enormous change, COVID-19 has been the great accelerator. And just within 12 months, we will probably see 20 years of advancement. Because all the technologies are here. We've got all the technology we ever need to realize the digital world, and connectivity is only one of them. We move, I think, in 2040 to the world of hyper-personalization, smart everything, smart people, smart homes, smart cities. But what I think is really interesting about London is the fact that perhaps half our office stock will now be reconverted back to apartments. We could see villages emerging in each of these big skyscrapers with their own social, residential, retail, entertainment space. And believe it or not, I'm actually a firm believer that we could easily go back to cottage industries, arts and craft economy, because the 3D printing, machine learning, the cloud will give us all, as creative people, the ability to access world markets. It will no longer be a small village affair. It will be a global affair, but organized much around the village. So that is actually a very provocative but very interesting thought. And of course, that highlights the role of the guilds. I think the guilds will come back. The London guilds, particularly, will be a force of nature in this new hyper-connected, hyper-personalized economy. And I think that the city of London itself is actually grappling right now with what does that brand bring to us in in 2040. So thank you. I hope I've provoked the discussion a little bit, Michael, but on to the next, I'm sure. Michael, I think you're muted.
Roger, that's a great opening, and we're going to hand over now to Richard O'Brien. As a member of 6 livery companies, I'm delighted that you see such a rosy future. Richard, are you clicking in there on your webcam, please?
Here we go.
Great, Richard. The floor is yours.
Yep. Thank you. First slide, please. Let's go. Yes, the most surprising thing for me over the past 20 years is how quickly inequality became not just a problem, but also a driver of change. and the explosion of myopic greed and insensitivity to grotesque inequality shown by the world of finance has been shocking. Next slide. The lesson I'd most apply for the next 20 years is that the inconvenient truth is that life for human beings will change radically quite quickly. For some issues, we've missed the opportunity to pick and choose our preferred destiny. That sounds a bit apocalyptic, but I do mean radical change is essential. How we distribute and share resources and opportunities, and how we live. The changes will be driven by the environmental challenge, the end of use of fossil fuels, drastic reduction in the use of energy, less travel, less trade, new methods of production. Secondly, using our new knowledge and technologies to address those challenges. Thirdly, new social distribution models. I always wondered how the inequalities across the world and within our own society could carry on without falling apart. I think it may well fall apart, haves into have-nots. Now, idealistic or not, it's a real challenge. The failure of communism says all the above is idealistic, a reaction which is reinforced when the anti-austerity message comes from a Corbyn McDonald corner. But our society is and feels very fragile. We must address these challenges outside our outdated mindsets. Liberals face the reality that all we once held dear just won't work anymore. My most confident statement for 2040 is that tinkering with existing models won't work. We may depend on shocks like COVID, climate change, mass migration to force change. For my generation, averting the apocalypse was about nuclear war. The new challenges are far less controllable. New technologies, including ways of communicating and working across geographies, offer reasons for hope. But our hitherto inability to act before it's too late gives cause for despair. Can we learn? Well, we must. I hope we learn from the COVID shock and not go back to attempted business as usual. Our reaction to the banking crash doesn't offer a good precedent. Perhaps, just as seeing the world as a globe from outer space for the first time is said to have changed our perspective, so seeing the virtual elimination of pollution in images over urban China and Italy under lockdown offers a vision of the possible. Deniers will say that the lockdown shows we can't afford to do less. I don't think we have a choice. In fact, we don't have a choice. And that's a quick summary. I'll leave it at there. Thank you.
Richard, thank you so much for that. A really big challenge. Now, we're now handing over to Jill. Jill, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Michael. So this is such a treat to reconnect with the people who both gave the Gresham series of lectures and also worked on the report. And I think it's interesting, the report did get some things right. And in fact, my co-author and I, Patricia Lustig, have written a recent pamphlet here looking at, in 2000, we did feel we were at a watershed. But as Roger's just said, in a way that didn't quite happen. But the question is whether, as Richard has just said, COVID-19 will actually force change. So you've asked us to think about three things in 3 minutes. And the first one was the most surprising thing for me over the past 20 years. Okay. This one is a bit of an embarrassment because in 2000, I was very public among people saying that this IT stuff will change the world. And it has. But what I did not anticipate was our dependence on a few major monopolistic IT platforms. And that applies to social media and phones, supply chains, combined with the naivety of society, that's most people, firms and governments, about the impact of the lack of resilience. I can see that the next big crash could be through a crash of our IT platforms because they're so monopolistic. And also, of course, people are naive about data misuse. So I'm surprised that society hasn't reformed around this IT stuff changing the world. And on the next slide, I talk about the lesson I'd most apply for the next 20 years. and I'm afraid it's a bit simple-minded. It's be curious. As we know, change comes from outside the domain, so it's really important to access a wide range of sources, both within and outside the comfort zone. It's often overlooked, and we get silos that reinforce each other. And the next slide is about the most confident statement I would make about 2040. And this is really mind-boggling. We've lived since the 70s with worry about, the world's population is going to keep increasing. No. What's happening is that global numbers by 2040 may well have started to decline, and the population will certainly have leveled out at about 8.5 billion. This has all sorts of implications for food supply, energy supply, and systems in general. But the side effect, of course, is that there'll be predominance of older people, which is going to disrupt a lot of our social and economic systems. And speculating, in China, where family size is decreased, there were 20% excess males. What would happen if we had a 20% excess of males globally? I've got a picture here of a marching army. Just a thought. So, finally, to conclude, on the next slide. Sorry, I thought I had another slide, which basically said, get in touch. I'm mostly a director of ethical reading these days, and I continue to do foresight work through SAMI and also through our website, Global Megatrends. Fine. Over to Oliver.
Good morning. First slide, thank you. We've been asked to answer three questions. The first is the most surprising things to me over the last 20 years. I would typify those as the smooth, unopposed, and seemingly inevitable emergence of China, which was a triumph of diplomacy similar to the USSR transition, and an astonishing achievement for the State Department. The second was the 2008-9 crash, which was unknowable because there were no data. Indeed, it was caused by poor data. We did, however, get the 9/11 use of passenger jets as cruise missiles because the data were there and we were able to understand that. The third point is the slow transition of technological progress into productivity. Solow, the great guru of productivity, said that computers were everywhere evident except in the productivity data, and this remains the case. Very slow progress. Next slide, please. Next slide. Sheriff, next slide.
They take a second to come through.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah. Lessons that I'd apply for the next 20 years. The data and diplomacy matter. You need to understand and react with empathy to the issues that face you. Systems understanding. There will be an enormous amount to understand and react to in the next 20 years. Next slide, please. Now we get to the interesting stuff about what happens in 2040. Primary thing that I see is the imminence of the overturn when the aging old rich world loses its monopoly. We used to have 90% of global production in our hands. It's now about 42%. By 2040, it'll be less than a quarter. 3 to 4 billion new middle class will emerge, implying a completely new political model, characterized by yearning for status and stability and fear of social erosion, deeply conservative. There will be roughly 2 billion trained new workers, which is double the OECD population at least. The sole response that the old rich world can make to this is automation. And automation leads to a number of things, one of which is commoditization, that everybody's cost profiles converge, which flattens supply curves, price falls close to cost, and profit disappears. All those except firms with defensible structural positions will suffer from this. The world will be 80% urbanized, despite the talk about rural villages and so on. Most analysts see 1,000 cities of over 5 million. We have 600 of them at the moment. Each city will participate in networks of specialized activity. in which competition is fervid and unceasing. Not to comply with industry dynamics leads to quick exclusion from a given network, particularly exclusion from capital and innovation. That means that these global networks essentially dictate policy to these cities, and the cities dictate policy to the nation state. Underlying this, economic apartheid will segment the population into the competent and the marginal cities, a lot of Detroits and trailer parks. Marginal populations will live under lockdown and virtuality by dint of environmental stringency, the whole range of things they won't be able to do. Democracy is increasingly incapable of handling social divisions of this sort. Populist calls to protect our jobs, to isolate and so on, cut trade, will be there, and there'll be a recipe for swift disaster. And the example of this will tend to sharpen minds and question whether you can permit populism. This is a hard, cold world in which the competent are boosted by automation, particularly what people are calling artificial intelligence, although that means a million things. The less so utterly marginalized, it's not a good time to be poor or of low educational attainment in the rich world. So I hope I'm not being too depressing, but there we go. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Oliver. A bit nasty, brutish, and short. And now I think let's hand on to Richard. Richard, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Michael. Let me try and be a little more positive, although much of my thinking aligns with what we've heard so far. In 2020, it seems to me we've moved more than 2 decades. It seems amazing when I reflect on sitting around having this discussion in the year 2000. We were talking about a move from a print-based industrial society to a technology-based internet society, and it's happened so very rapidly. What I said was that this meant for the professions, which was my focus in 2000, that there'd be a move from the one-to-one consultative advisory service that characterizes professions, doctors, lawyers, accountants, and so forth, to the delivery of guidance and help online, a form of information service. And I think what's most surprised me in the period since 2000, partly actually, if I can say lighthearted on a personal note, the most surprising thing for me is that I, 15 years later, co-authored a book on the subject with my son Daniel, who's an economist at Oxford. We wrote a book called The Future of the Professions. So that was a surprise. I don't think I would ever have anticipated that in 2000. But what struck us when we were undertaking our research for that book was the scale of some of the achievements. William Gibson once said, "The future has arrived. It's just not evenly distributed yet." I think there's much in that, but we've seen, for example, in education, in 1 year, more people signed on to Harvard's online courses than have attended that physical university since its foundation. In law, on eBay, for instance, every year there are 60 million disputes, none of them, interestingly, settled by lawyers and courts, all of them sorted out by online dispute resolution. And in more creative professions, for example, like architecture, we look at the Hamburg Concert Hall, a beautiful building, and it's hard to imagine that that was largely designed by algorithm. And so the scale of achievement in 2 decades has been quite phenomenal. But I think we're just warming up now, and we're still at the foothills. It seems to me that the biggest lesson we've learned from the last 2 decades is the importance of moving away from automation to transformation. Automation is the idea of grafting technology onto pre-existing, often inefficient processes. The real advances that have been made in the professions have been using technology not to streamline and improve our old ways of working, but allowing us to work in new and entirely different ways. And that's got to be the way ahead, I think, not just for the professions, but in technology generally, moving away from an automation to a transformation mindset. So what do I imagine by 2040? In all, and I know this sounds rather doomy and gloomy for those who are in the professions, I think there'll be much less professional work to do. The traditional professions, much of their everyday work will have been in one way or another replaced by machines. Because if you subscribe to the thesis, certainly that Daniel and I evolved, that our machines are becoming increasingly capable, it follows then that more and more of the work of human beings will in one way or another be taken on by machines. Now, many will say, of course, well, we've been here before, new jobs will arise. But the evidence so far suggests that the new jobs that arise, the new tasks that arise, are actually ones that machines will take on too. So we find it hard to avoid the conclusion, and it is consistent with what happened to so many of the crafts in the city, whether it be the mercers, the cordwainers, the wheelwrights. We still use silk. We still use leather goods. We still use wheels. We've just changed the whole mechanics, the underlying infrastructure that gives rise to these products. So too in the professions. We'll see a move away fundamentally from the delivery of professional productivity based on labor to one based on capital, but it's a new form of capital. It's intellectual capital. Online professional service, in one way or another, enabled by artificial intelligence, will dominate the guidance that people will need in the 40s. Now, I see this as good news. Many people say, gosh, what a threatening, awful prospect. But that's very, very much a provider-oriented view, isn't it? From the point of view of recipients, wouldn't it be wonderful if 8 billion people had access online to healthcare? Wouldn't it be wonderful if 8 billion people had access online to educational services? Wouldn't it be wonderful if 8 billion people were able to understand and enforce their legal entitlements? Well, I think that's where we'll be in 2040. We'll fulfill the dream I talked about, disintermediation. That's to say, removing human beings from the chain where we can, at a low cost, in a low-cost way, make traditional service more accessible. So mine's an upbeat view of the future. And I think in terms of the enabling technologies, it aligns with other people's views. But I want to say we should view these technologies, I insist, not from a producer, but from a recipient point of view. Back to you, Michael, in our ZN studio.
Thank you so much, Richard, for that cogent and swift explanation. Chris, the floor is yours if you want to click in there. Welcome.
Yeah. Right, next slide. Right. One of the things that people keep saying is that we're living in unprecedented times, and a lot of things are totally outside. But I think that, I'll give tribute to Oliver Sparrow, who in 1996 told me in one of our early meetings that .com was a bubble then, and I watched it. But his description as to why and why it would burst turned out to be remarkably accurate. Timing, as always, is a problem. There are two things that I want to try and draw out as I think that have been real surprises for me that I think underline some of the challenges going forward. We've had the explosion in data, we thought, but actually organizational memory has been absolutely shot apart. In 2008, the FT reported that there was only one person in the Treasury who had been in the Treasury during the ERM. Now, a number of the organizations that I'm aware of asking for government funding actually had pandemic scenarios in 2002, and they haven't updated them. I think outsourcing the use of management consultants has led to a situation where our organizations have become increasingly transactional. And what it's labeled is very large organizations to dominate, but they are incredibly not resilient. The other side, I think, that's actually been important is that there's an increasing body of information that says that innovation is slowing down, not speeding up. Robert Gordon's book here has shown that the pace of innovation in the United States has been slowing down since 1970. It's interesting when you look at what the most significant innovation is since 2000, I'd argue it was CRISPR-Cas9. Because without it, and it could not have worked without the internet, we wouldn't have been able to decode the COVID RNA in 6 weeks. The chances of being able to create a vaccine is there because of that underlying thing. So the interesting thing for me is that the real innovations are coming outside technology, outside of traditional technologies, but using technological innovation to do interesting things. So next slide. So I too think that the really interesting thing about all the technological revolutions, and I think Carlos Perez, the economist, has done a lot on this, is that each time we've had a technological revolution, we've come up with new organizational forms, such as the platform organization. We've come up with new financial instruments. Exactly what they are, I think, is not clear. But the real challenge is, and I think Jill touched on it, is this whole issue of life expectancy. Are we going to see life expectancy fall? Or, 5 years ago, I was being told the first person to grow to 150 was already born. But I want to try to draw your attention very quickly to two things that are not surprises in that they're issues, but how we will tackle them and how we will use technology to tackle them are clear. The first is on energy security. The big problem with artificial intelligence is that currently, if we could create an AGI, an artificial general intelligence of human level, it would require at the moment, the estimate is about 200 kilowatts. The human brain runs at 20 to 25 watts. If we're going to get anywhere near the vision of AI, we need huge leaps in energy technologies. And I think this is going to be one of the real challenges. I'm sure it's going to come, but I just don't know where it's coming from. The second one, where I think it's not a surprise that it's an issue, but I think how we tackle it is food security. So how will veganism develop? Will we get 3D printed meat? How we will change our diets? How will eating out change? So I think that the fact that energy security and food security will not be surprises in the sense they're bound to be big issues, but how we tackle them is going to be, I think, a real problem. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Chris. And John, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, and good morning, everyone. I have to say, I'm hoping my presentation or my thoughts will be a glass half full. So I think that's where we have to be at the moment. Looking back at the vision for 2000, in 2004, 2020, I think it's largely happened, as Jules said earlier. London remained a global player. It's dynamic, creative, and innovative. It attracted people from all over the world. It's a global financial hub. It's an entertainment hub and a great place to live, as says somebody who's lived here for the last 75 years. Technology is persuasive as an enabler. Globalization has played a key role in this, as in the past, in confirming London's status. So looking forward, if we could have the next slide. Yeah. For 2040, as in 2020, I think we can predict that technology will do all we want it to. I think people are the limiting factor. And I remember the general suspicion for the mobile market. We don't even call it that anymore. When I started what is now O2 in 1983. But if it has utility, it will fly. I see the main challenges for London, and indeed for most people in the world, being xenophobia, anti-globalization, and climate change. And a number of those are key undercurrents in many countries at the moment. And many see globalization as practiced now as responsible for climate change. Technology can help overcome the challenges, allowing London to continue as a hub of expertise and enterprise. It will draw in people from around the world. It will need to draw in people from around the world, both virtually and in person. The city will need to repurpose itself, and that point has been made already, in physical assets, to move to a more live-work environment. I think the blocks that I see being built across the river from where I live in the city, I think will change their roles, will have to change their roles to meet the new requirements. Drowning by the Thames, I think, can be avoided. We need a new Thames barrier. There will be less travel, we need less travel, and more efficient use of transport. All those things can harness IT tailored to sensing the environment, which increasingly we do. Connectivity can be taken as read. IT will become increasingly tailored to the individual's needs, such as health monitoring, probably with implants being as standard. So in the shadow of lockdown, I can see how IT can help London to deal with the turbulence and the challenges faced both near and long term. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Well, Tim, you wanted to be tail gunner. You're tail gunner. Try and summarize this. Over to you, Tim.
Okay, in a few words. Predicting the future has a long history, and futuristic stories actually go back to Roman times and before, and what was once called scientific romance did actually spot a number of things that have happened. H.G. Wells foresaw satellite TV and the internet, and Geoffrey Hoyle, son of Sir Fred Hoyle, wrote a book called 2011 Living in the Future back in 1972, whereby children were going to school on the internet and their parents were commuting by jetpack. Some of it worked and some of it quite possibly not. Now, being more pragmatic, future projections and calculations are widespread and go well beyond speculation. Reports such as the publications by the London Assembly or the ongoing London Plan look ahead out as far as 2050 and cover such predictable topics as population change and the role of key services such as transport, water, energy and housing. Mike, could we have the next slide, please? But added to that, we have the unpredictable. Did we even think about COVID-19 6 to 9 months ago, even though planning for pandemics, as we've just heard, goes back to at least 2002? Speculation about even the immediate future is not necessarily reliable before we take longer-term factors into account, such as climate change, the rising of sea levels, as John mentioned, drought, and food emergencies. Next slide, please. So there are things we know we can control or at least anticipate. Things we now realise we can't control, perhaps should try to anticipate. Added to that, we have the unknowns, which can only lead to further speculation, and we have to consider what disaster planning we can reasonably engage in, given the cost of being on standby, if we are ever to be prepared for the unthinkable. However, it would be irresponsible for any government not to take stock of future needs. Today's webinar has given us a chance to look at a serious forward projection exercise to review that in the light of experience, and that is valuable in itself, which will make us think not only how things might pan out in future, but also how to make reasonable provision for whatever might occur. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Tim. It is in many ways extremely difficult to force so many distinguished speakers to make pithy comments, and I would point out that we've had some really good things. Jonathan Law said the brief format is so compelling, so he congratulates you all for being quick about it. We have an interesting point here from Angel Gaviero Bestiero, who says organizational memory loss spot on, but how to recover it in a future of overwhelming speed and information. I'd like, though, to move to a couple of questions. Firstly, from a fellow Gresham professor, Carolyn Roberts. She has asked, although there have been references to climate change, only John Carrington has mentioned the implications of large temperature increases for living in the centre of London and the possibility of more flooding, not just from the Thames, but more widely spread. Any comments? Roger, might that be one for you?
I'd probably like to hand that one back to John. I'm not a great speculator on climate change. John, do you want to pick that up one?
I think this is yes, I think it's a really serious matter for London, because the key parts of the city and Canary Wharf up to Westminster and beyond are actually threatened. And I think it was last year, I don't think it's happened so much this year, but the current barrier was closed more times, I think, last year than in the previous 20 years. So it's something we have to take seriously. And it's about, I think, both physical protection, but also recognizing what are the triggers of climate change. And I think the current reliance upon devices like the ones we're using at the moment would help to concentrate people's mind that you don't have to travel, you don't have to use resources in order to be efficient and effective. That won't mean that we don't meet, but we don't really meet so often. And I look back at my day trips to New York using Concorde with great shame.
Now, Paolo Trinotti here talks about implants and standards. He'd like you to tell us more. Martin Watkins, in a related question, says, does the panel believe that technology will advance to unforeseen levels in the coming years, and that ecosystems and communities will transform at such a pace that rerunning this seminar discussion will be every 3 years or less? So really about the pace of technology, slower, faster? Who would like to comment on that?
Could I come into that one?
Go right ahead.
Michael.
And turn your webcam on, please. Great. Oh, thank you, Roger.
I think the most interesting aspect today is what I would call the verbal, visual, virtual revolution. We are obviously now able to visually communicate together extremely successfully. Zoom is part of our repertoire. What will happen in 10 to 15 years' time in that space of virtual reality? Because I think that actually holds the key to this whole issue of travel and dispersion of labor. How can we be in two places at once? And of course, there's a whole range of technology available today, but it's still not mass market. So just as the smartphone coming in, the iPhone, for example, 2008, revolutionized visual communication, Facebook, FaceTime, I'm looking for a big transformation in this virtual reality space. Once that comes, I think the world will be very different.
Oliver, you wanted to comment?
Yeah, of course. If you have contextually aware software that you can place on the equivalent of your cell phone so that it knows who you're talking to, where you are, what you're about, this becomes a major economic force. And it's something which we have no idea how to do, but that will probably emerge as a consequence of the massive increases in computing power on the cloud somewhere in the next 10 to 15 years. If you have that, basically, the only thing we have at the moment that looks like an artificial intelligence is a company. It's a diffuse entity which processes information on processors made of people. If you can augment that with machinery of the sort that I've just described, you get an extraordinary explosion in capability. And it's a delocated explosion. End it.
Yep. Richard?
Yeah, one of the issues about technology, I think, might be the tragedy of technology in the context we have. While it can probably solve everything and go to unforeseen levels, the other constraints, such as what Chris was mentioning, the AI needs so much energy, is that we will potentially have solutions we can't afford to use because we won't have the resources to be able to use them. And I think that's technology would need to tackle their way around that. Otherwise, it'll be something that'll have to stay on the shelf. And of course, unfortunately, many of our technologies do stay on the shelf, and they do require some sort of trigger before they're used. Or some of the simple ones are just not used for some, whether it's malaria, tablets, etc. We seem to be pretty useless sometimes at using the things that can solve the problems, partly because we're too keen on the next bit of technology.
Okay. Richard, it's great that you've come in, because one of the questions we have here for you is we're hearing in the UK that privately educated children are accelerating ahead of state-educated children during lockdown due to the ability to pay for the transformation to high-quality connectivity and education. Does Richard Susskind believe the gap will widen greatly over the next 20 years as we eliminate lower-level jobs and require transformally adept skills?
I think that question could be applied equally across all professions, that the reality is that unless this is actively managed, we will arrive at a situation where the concentration of power and wealth and data and technology is such that it benefits the few who are well off and deprive those who aren't. We see this in online courts, we see this in online medicine, and we certainly see it in online education. It's striking, as the questioner asks, how many independent schools have coped so much better, at least anecdote reports, than state schools who have not had the resource to make the platform supported by adequate teaching available. My hope is that we use this period as a large unscheduled pilot or experiment, and that we look very hard at what works well and what works less well in education, law, and elsewhere. We capture that, and then we fully integrate that into our public systems. The danger is, and I understand this, the everyday pressure of just keeping afloat is such that there isn't time to do more than manage, but we need to do more than manage. We need to lead, and leadership involves long-term thinking about the impact of these emerging technologies. So what I'm calling for is that leaders with schools are given bandwidth to capture data about the use of these systems in action, and on a collective basis across the country to find ways of harnessing this technology. I was struck today by the news that Cambridge in 2021 has decided not to be giving standard lectures. But that led me to something that I think I perhaps even said in 2000, It's slightly bizarre in our public education system that we have an astonishing amount of repetition up and down the country. So for any one particular subject, you can have thousands of biology teachers, thousands of English teachers, and so forth, insofar as they're acting as the sage and the stage, essentially trying to pass over the same knowledge and insights. What we now have the possibility in the state sector is of pooling our resources, and for individual subjects, at least as I said, for the sage and the stage part, putting together a wonderful portfolio of the various finest of teachings that can be shared across schools, therefore sharing the cost across the state of this outstanding teaching material. And here I also see a role for the independent sector and the public sector to work together, because some of the wonderful materials that are already being produced for private schools could be available at no marginal cost to the state system. That doesn't mean that there's the tutoring, the coaching, the mentoring, the nurturing that goes along with the better teaching that happens in better schools, but at least gives you standard, outstanding source materials.
Okay. Tim, did you want to kick in?
Yes, just coming there on the university question, interesting about Cambridge with the lectures going online next year. The student reaction seems to be very negative, because a lot of the less evident elements of university education just aren't going to be there, the social side. And I think this is the worry with children not having access to school at the moment. It's development of social skills. Now, we're talking about the importance of technology, but in other contexts, we also talk about the importance of the soft skills, the negotiating skills, the team working, getting on with people, basically. And if we focus too much on the technology, there is a very real danger that the isolation that this brings about will have social impacts that we haven't actually thought about.
I think that's true, Tim, but Cambridge, I think, were careful also to say that there was no question, insofar as within their powers, of trying to eliminate tutorials and other smaller gatherings. I think it was just with a view to the very large gatherings that was said, and it was for health reasons too. I think the experience of coming together in groups, networking in a variety of ways and sharing and learning experiences is very important. Whether or not that needs to be done through large-scale lecture halls is not entirely clear. I'd have to say, and I won't speak for all universities, but it's certainly some of the universities I've spoken at, lecture theatres are often sparsely occupied, unlike tutorials and other smaller sessions, which tend to be better attended. So we have to be clear what it is in many universities we're replacing. Perhaps a modest quality, poorly attended forum, which we can upgrade to an outstanding quality of presentation, as long as it's supported by the kind of human interaction to which Tim's drawing our attention.
Yeah, I'd like to add a particular point. The UK actually has about 30 odd years of research into the use of technology in schools. And I'm doing a webinar this afternoon at 3:30 for head teachers to get their head around it. And the big problem is not the innovation, it's the diffusion of innovation. I mean, even within an outstanding school, you get some teachers who are doing really advanced things with the technology and others that haven't. So the pace at which you can transform a profession depends upon, one, the quality of the research base and the ability to translate that research base into professional practice. And I think that that's also true at university level. A JISC study 4 years ago showed that while at Russell Group universities, that while young people coming to university were totally au fait with the technologies, that did not mean that they were confident with using those technologies to learn. And the key thing is creating confident learners. And that includes creating teachers as confident learners. And I still don't see the research base being built up fast enough to meet the transformation of the professions in the way that I think we could see what's possible. But I think we've got to look at that translation of professional research into professional practice, and where's it happening?
I'm just going to move us on a bit. The audience out here also agrees. Bob McDowell, for example, concerned about isolation, perhaps picking up. Oliver, I'm going to move over to you, if I might, for a second. There are a series of questions here. Doug McWilliams points out that the panel really didn't ascribe a very large role to politics. Richard Folan says, as an ex-diplomat, I was interested in the statement made by Oliver that diplomacy will matter in the future, i.e. the need for future. But he was wondering how that squares with this rather depressing view of a hard, cold world in 2040. So what's the role of empathy and diplomacy in this world ahead?
Trying to knock the hard, sharp edges off the world that's coming, I think. Politics is the mechanism that we use to obfuscate conflict. It's how we don't rip each other's throats out. We fudge things in smoke-filled rooms and get things to happen. Diplomacy is an even politer mechanism of doing the same thing. And as the opportunity for throat ripping will increase significantly over the next 30 years, we will need more and more emollients to avoid this, I think would be my basic point.
Okay. Ashutosh Shastri goes on, how will globalization and cities driving national governments play out in emerging markets, China, India, Brazil, Turkey? Would anybody like to comment on that? Jill, perhaps?
Yes. Yes.
Yep.
I think the data is that urbanization is taking place much more outside North America and Western Europe. It's in other places. And so the 1,000 cities of 5 million or more that China is using as a research base to get self-sufficient cities in terms of energy infrastructure, in terms of water infrastructure, in terms of food infrastructure. I think the data I had was that by 2040, something like half of those cities may well be in Africa, which is an amazing transformation if it happens. Because at the moment, Africa, as we know, is still mainly extractive industries and rural. I see Oliver's popped in and may well have better data on that. Mine was from memory. Over to Oliver.
Sounds good, although I don't think China's going to have the 1,000 cities. That's more global.
No, I meant globally, but the research I referred to was in China.
Yeah, no, there's massive urbanization going on in developing countries, which happens in a sequential way. They tend to go to mid-sized towns, then commute to the bigger ones and finally settle in them. Africa will have 3 billion people by the turn of the century, so there'll be a third of humanity. Half of all the people under the age of 16 alive at the moment live in Africa. There aren't jobs for them, there isn't water for them, and there probably isn't food for them. So what's going to become of all of that is entirely imponderable, but that's one of the sharp edges we need to deal with.
Well, folks, we're running, sadly, to the end of time, and I've got a question I'd like to ask each of you quickly. It really forms two parts. The audience have had a lot of comments. So, we've got nearly well over 100 people online. So they're questioning productivity, where the jobs of the future come from. Will democracy change? How can democracies actually make sensible long-term decisions? There's a lot of support for many of your comments here, and I'll get these all passed on to you. But just to close, sort of a double question. My colleague Ian Harris would like to know from each of you, what one thing do you think you would most like to know? What one externality would knock your predictions off course? And the second related part to that is from Jane Wormleighton. What do you see as the principal driver? Is it going to be industry? Is it going to be technology? Is it going to be education? Is it going to be government? I know it's all of those, but try and pick one. So just to repeat, what would throw your predictions off course, or would you most like to know about, and what's going to be the driver to really keep an eye on? And I'm afraid I'll just do that in the order that we began. So Roger, could I start with you?
Sure. Just come on board, yeah. I think the biggest concern at the moment is the global grab for power between East and West, and particularly China, and its obvious ambitions to dominate, certainly emerging markets, but increasingly Western markets too. Will this continue at pace, as we've talked about, or will it be curtailed to some extent? I think this is a really big question in any scenario for the future. The drivers themselves, again, one of the things that must intrigue us all is the role of the superclass, the billionaires who may by 2040 become trillionaires. And what does that mean in terms of where do they put their money? And Bill Gates is a great example of this. How can they, more than nation states, actually affect change?
Thank you. Richard O'Brien?
Yes, thank you. When we look at globalization, that was all driven by the freedom of movement of goods, services, information, but also people. And we've seen the migration movements of the last few years radically changing the way we govern a lot of things. And it comes to me, my biggest question would be, can we develop an e-society that works? Because we've realized during COVID and lockdown that there is a difference between communicating online, despite Zoom and all this, and the personal touch. But it may be we need a system where we can do the system safely. That applies to politics, where so much is now, if you like, out in the open. You can't have these smoke-filled rooms anymore, but you still need to reach some sort of conclusions. And on the personal side, we need safe systems, because at the moment we're still trying to match how do you have a private conversation online that doesn't turn out to be private, etc. And that's it would apply to all our social systems. The same for our education. If we're not going to have all these lessons in person, how do we replace them with something that is just as good online? Because, of course, technology allows a lot of communication in conversation that doesn't happen in a personal group. So that would be my big thing. I put my big question is really about how people communicate.
Fantastic. I'm now stuffed. I can't remember. Was it Oliver or Jill next?
I think it's alphabetic. So I'll go. And I think the conversation's been very interesting. It does, however, show signs of us all being siloed, us all coming from an information technology background and being halfway through exploring all. Yes, okay, Oliver.
Okay, you two.
We're in the middle of exploring, what goes right and what goes wrong. For me, the biggest uncertainty over the next couple of decades, and the one I'd really like the answer to, is which parts of biotech turn out to be good for society? How do we manage it? Because this is a totally different dimension. It's one we've started exploring, I think, through information technology, but some of the dimensions of biotech are just totally new. And I don't see the same attention to thinking about that as this sort of panel, for instance, is thinking about information technology.
Oliver, while I'm handing over to you folks, you'll notice that I'm just launching the summarization poll as well. Oliver, floor is yours.
Okay, what would I like to know? I started a discussion on the internet which led to a flame war, which was called the string or the slinky. And it was about how upgradable were people. To what extent could technology improve us and improve our capabilities? We've had this in education, we've had it in a variety of other concepts. But are our populations like a string where you grab one end and lift it and everybody moves up together? Or are they like a slinky, that floppy spring thing, where you lift one end and it goes up and the other end doesn't move at all? You keep going, it still doesn't go. How improvable are our population, given the augmentation that's likely to come from information systems of one sort or another? The second question was, what was the chief driver of change? And I would say that was the aspiration of the billions in the emerging economies. The 4 or 5 billion people who seriously and deeply want to get rich and really don't give a damn about the poor, the environment, or anything else. They are going to drive the futures that we have to live, whether we like it or not. And any amount of recycling and niceness in the Western world will make absolutely no difference whatsoever. Britain has its carbon dioxide levels down to what they were in 1890, but it's still only 2% of the world's emissions. It doesn't matter what we do. It's what happens in the billions of people who are going to get rich that matter. Thank you.
Richard, over to you.
My point's not unrelated to the last one. My main concern is about an excessive concentration of power and ownership of data and technology in a small number of privately owned organizations. It seems to me that this future, certainly the future of technology, is too important to be left on or a relatively unregulated market. So what could throw my own aspirations and hopes for a democratization of knowledge and professional guidance would be that that aim simply doesn't align with the main market players. What will drive it all on, I think very positively here, is the curiosity, the creativity of human beings, our inclination as human beings to want to push back the boundaries, to want to explore, develop new knowledge and new techniques to help us live in different ways. So the drivers are this innate, I think, curiosity and creativity that many of us have.
Very good. John? Sorry, my apologies. Chris, yes, then John.
Yeah. I think for me, I mean, Jill touched on biotech, and I think that's an important one. But one of the other technologies that's was supposed to be mainstream by 2020 was synthetic biology. And I was going to lecture, and it hasn't happened. But the interesting thing is, going back to the issues on climate change, there were a number of possibilities and a number of things demonstrated at small scale that would enable us to deal with plastic pollution, plastic waste, to do with it. But none of them have yet scaled up. If that technology and that set of technologies can be made to work economically scale, it can tackle an awful lot of problems. And that's the thing I would like to know, whether that's going to be ready in 2025 or 2050, because at the moment people give me all that range.
Very good. John?
I'm just going to pick up I think it's the same point, one presented two ways. What could blow us off course and what would be the driver for success? And I think it comes back to really at a different level. What could really blow us off course is the loss of any balance of power and the retreat from globalization, a standoff that would actually defeat the things that we need for success, which I could summarize as, I suppose, free trade in goods, free trade in people, free trade in ideas, and free trade in information. And history tells us this. The setbacks that we've had in the past of when there have been standoffs, and we can't afford those. Everything that we said we would like to see happen will be undermined or allowed to happen, whichever way that goes. Thank you.
Thank you. And Tim?
Yes, going back to literary sources, there are two pathways in the future. One is utopia and one is dystopia. And these can be fairly accurate, as we saw with some of H.G. Wells. On the other hand, I was looking this morning at a film that came out in 1973 called Soylent Green, and it included Charlton Heston, so it's obviously quite important. Made in 1973 and set in the year 2022. It could not be more wildly off course than anything else which has ever come out in the last 2,000 years when trying to predict the future. The key thing, I think, as far as the biotech is concerned, is can we solve the problem of plastics? Because by 2040 we'll be drowning in the stuff if we've not found a way of disposing of it.
Wow. Well, folks, that was a tour de force indeed, highly constrained by time. I would like to say, of course, thank you to Tim Connell and John Carrington for getting this going, and thank you to all the panelists for reassembling and being so pithy with your remarks. It just remains to me to sort of look at the closing word. I had sort of anticipated this split between utopia and dystopia, optimism and pessimism, so often in these cases, and as I've been wont to say, something along the lines of let's be optimistic, pessimism is for better times. But I just love this quote from Macaulay back in 1850. It's a lengthy quote, but it ends, "On what principle is it that with nothing but improvement behind us, we are to expect nothing but deterioration before us?" And so I hope you have a lot to cogitate on. I will be sending the panelists the questions so that they can, in fact, get back to some of you individually who I know are there. We've had a lot of comments. There's certainly a strong thread running that we ought to figure out how to get the teenies and naughties into these livery companies that Roger was speaking about, and perhaps running another session with a few of the more younger people giving us their view on 2040 and I suspect 2060. But it remains for me merely to say thank you for coming and participating so actively online. We really appreciate it, and we hope to have several more events looking at the future in the months to come. As ever, everything's on the website, but there are some really good events coming, not least tomorrow when we'll be looking at genuine biases, empirical research on biases in the trustees' decision-making on pension funds. So it remains for me to say thanks to all of you, and I'm afraid I'll join, as I can only do at this moment in COVID-19, in a virtual hand clap for our panelists and an appreciation for all their hard work in making today really quite a success. Thank you very much.